Greetings of peace and solidarity to my sisters and brothers across the faith communities of Asia and the Pacific and Middle East. I am Reverend Cathy Chang. Together with my family, we serve as mission co-workers, commissioned by the Presbyterian Church, USA. The United Church of Christ in the Philippines, UCCP, has invited me to serve with migrant ministry, and they are among the churches and other organizations with whom we serve side by side for God's purposes. Sensing God's call to serve with the Filipino people and the people of other Southeast Asian countries, our family moved from the United States to the Philippines in March 2016. These early years have introduced me to people, churches, organizations that support migrant workers, also known as Overseas Filipino Workers, OFWs, and their families. Although we live in the Philippines, I've had the privilege of traveling to different regions around the Philippines, as well as other countries, such as Hong Kong, Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, the United Arab Emirates, and more recently, Morocco and Ecuador. Although I have visited many places, my home and my heart are in the Philippines, and serve as the frame of reference in understanding our mission work. Now, since March 2020, due to the Philippine quarantine measures imposed by the government, our family has been sheltering in place at our home in Quezon City in the Philippines. As a Christian minister, I've searched the scriptures to help us understand who we are and who God is, and who God is calling us to become. The global COVID-19 pandemic has challenged the will to survive for overseas Filipino workers. Some OFWs are still abroad, working as frontliners or unemployed because of no work, no pay. Others are trying to come back to the Philippines, and others are stranded in quarantine facilities and waiting for swab test results, waiting to go to their home provinces, and waiting to see if they will be deployed to work abroad. In a similar way, I began to see with new eyes the overseas Filipino worker experience through the famine and the will to survive in Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah. Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah are biblical characters who could reflect the contemporary experiences of Filipinos. The vulnerability and the resilience of the Filipino people, especially the young girls and women, remind me of Ruth and Naomi. And the bold and the daring work of our Filipino colleagues remind me of BOAZ. The conditions for life and for Ruth and Naomi are like the conditions of the Filipino people. Rural peasants and indigenous peoples depend on the land for their food and their livelihood. Women and men work the land, and many will never own it because of a landowner and an economic system that prevents them. For some indigenous peoples, their ancestral lands are under threat because the Philippine government and military would prefer to develop it for their commercial purposes. While working the land, women are vulnerable to harassment and other forms of violence from their employer or co-workers who take advantage of them. But not everyone in the Philippines lives off the land. But everyone is seeking to live, to survive, and to thrive. Some migrate from rural and other far-flung provinces to try to make a living in the big cities, while others will migrate abroad. All of this to escape the burdens of poverty and bring more blessings for their families. Working in the big cities and in countries outside the Philippines help the Filipino people to provide for food, to pay for school fees, to pay for medicines and medical bills. As a wealthy landowner, BOAZ demonstrated that he and his workers held themselves to higher standards and establishes new expectations so that nobody would take advantage of their younger female workers. And everybody worked in a safe and healthy environment. Thankfully, what turned out to be Ruth's means of survival in working the fields of BOAZ does not turn out badly into harassment and abuse. BOAZ embodies how one person can make a difference and help vulnerable people to make a fresh start when he creates new expectations within his religious, cultural, political, and economic systems. BOAZ is not the only person who demonstrates God's constant care for vulnerable people within his religious, cultural, political, economic systems. For those who would dare envision another Filipino society not constrained to those who seek to colonize and control it, as well as corrupt governments who lord over the everyday people. Our Filipino colleagues use their human and spiritual resources in teaching, praying, singing, preaching, reporting, testifying, lawyering, as they work and they live for the betterment of their fellow Filipino countrymen. These Filipino colleagues are from churches, faith communities, and organizations that are alleviating the sufferings, but are also envisioning a society in which people can thrive, not only live and survive. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, our colleagues worked and lived in this way, and even now during the pandemic, they continue. And after this pandemic, I'm confident that they will continue to work and live in this way. On behalf of those Filipino colleagues with whom we serve in the Inform Network, I'm inviting you to join us, or if you already are, to recommit yourselves to this network. There's a lot of work to be done. Together, let's strengthen our support, services, and solidarity for our migrants, with whom we assert their rights and dignity.